Judge Robert Harlan slammed his gavel and shouted for security to drag Alicia Monroe out of his courtroom just because she dared to speak up for justice. He thought he was teaching her a lesson, but days later he'd learned she was the one sent to judge him. What happens when arrogance meets accountability in the same courtroom? If this story moves you, give it a like and share it with someone who still believes in justice. Now let's step inside that courtroom and see how it all began. I remember the heat first. Fulton County, Georgia. One of those heavy mornings where the air presses down on your shoulders and the light comes in dull through dusty panes. The courtroom smelled like old wood and old arguments. People shifted in their benches, whispering, fanning themselves with folded papers, waiting for the day to start judging someone who wasn't them. Judge Robert Harlan took his seat like he owned the oxygen. White robe, white hair 60, if a day the kind of man who made silence feel like an order. His eyes scanned the room once and turned colder as if the day had already disappointed him. You could feel the staff snap into an invisible line bailiff. At attention, stenographer, poised the young clerk Ethan Cole, adjusting a stack of files he'd already straightened twice. They called the case, a police beating complaint. A man with a stitched eyebrow and hands that wouldn't stop trembling sat 2 rows ahead of me. His wife held his wrist as if steadying the hurt. The attorney on one side stood. The prosecutor on the other looked like he'd seen 100 of these and planned to see 100 more. Then she stepped forward. Alicia Monroe, black woman, maybe early 40s, white blouse, nothing flashy, not timid, not loud. She walked like she'd walked across rooms like this before, and like those rooms hadn't always been kind. She took the witness stand and raised her right hand. She didn't blink. Harlan leaned forward just enough to make a point. State your name and don't waste this court's time. His voice was a blade. Alicia swallowed the sting like she'd done it before. Alicia Monroe, she said, steady as a plumb line. No apology in it, no tremor. The prosecutor started in with the questions that sound neutral if you've never tasted them. Where were you standing? How far were you? Are you sure you saw what you think you saw? The kind that turns your eyes into liars and your memory into fog. Alicia answered cleanly. Tight. She didn't reach for speeches. She just told the truth and let it sit there. Then came the one that always comes, the loaded question with maybe and perhaps coiled inside it. Perhaps the prosecutor suggested the officer raised his voice because your crowd was provoking him. The word hung like a bad smell. Your crowd. Alicia's eyes hardened a fraction. She leaned toward the mic. Respectfully, that's not accurate. The judge snapped his gaze up a hawk-scenting movement. The prosecutor pushed again, softer this time, but sharper. Alicia lifted her chin. Respectfully, she repeated, You're assuming the officer. The gavel cracked the room in half. Harlan's face went a shade darker. You people think you can argue law. Sit down or get out, you people. It rolled across the benches like heat lightning. A couple of heads dipped. Someone coughed. Most folks pretended they hadn't heard what they heard. The clerk, Ethan, thin-tie, earnest eyes froze with a file halfway to the desk, as if moving would make it worse. Alicia didn't flinch. She stood, not defiant, not meek, just rooted. She looked at Harlan the way a person looks at a locked door they've decided to walk through anyway. I came for justice, she said, voice, low, clear, carrying not your permission. Simple words, no ornament. They landed heavier than the gavel. A beat, a longer beat. I felt the room tilt, anger, fear, that strange jitter when somebody says the thing you wish you had the courage to say. Harlan's jaw worked. Color rose to his cheeks. He leaned over the bench like he wanted to close the distance with weight alone. Officer, remove her, now. The bailiff hesitated, half a breath, long enough for the command to feel like a choice, then moved. Another officer joined him. Boots on tile. The sound of authority when it thinks it's been challenged. Alicia didn't fight. She didn't plead. She didn't look at the gallery to recruit sympathy. She simply gathered the edges of her blouse, stepped down from the stand, and let them take an elbow each. The prosecutor stared at his legal pad like it had suddenly become more interesting. The defense attorney looked at the ceiling. The man with stitches in his brow turned away. And Ethan. He watched. That's all. But there was something in his face, shame mostly. Shame has a shape when it sits on a decent man's shoulders. He glanced at Harlan, then back at Alicia, as if learning in real time which direction the floor sloped. They escorted her down the aisle. I remember the small sounds, the soft squeak of leather on wood, the scrape of a bench as someone pulled their knees in, Alicia's bracelets tapping against her wrist with each step. She held her head-level eyes straight ahead, not letting the moment feed on her. She passed my brow close enough for me to see the tiniest tremor in her lip. It wasn't fear. It was something older, something that remembers all the rooms where you means you don't belong. At the door, she paused as the bailiff reached for the handle. She didn't look back at Harlan. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the seal of the court burned into the wood, her mouth set. Then she walked through. The door closed with a soft, decisive thud. The echo folded into the breathing of the room. Harlan lifted the gavel again lightly this time, as if even he had heard too much of himself, and said, "Proceed." We did. Or pretended to. But the air had shifted. The wife's hand tightened on her husband's wrist. A woman in the back row shook her head slow, like a prayer that doesn't expect an answer. The prosecutor cleared his throat and started back in, but his voice had lost a notch of confidence. Even the fluorescent light seemed to hum a different note. I noticed Ethan slide the file he'd been clutching to the side and pick up another. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man performing a small ritual to keep the room from breaking apart. He didn't look at the judge again. He didn't look at the door either. He stared at the empty witness chair, the space where truth had tried to sit and been told to stand up and leave. A few minutes later, a clerk returned quietly from the hallway. She whispered to the stenographer, who blinked hard and kept typing. The bailiff resumed his post with the mask of indifference you practice until it becomes a skin. Harlan carried on as if nothing had happened, as if words didn't bruise, as if a gavel could turn humiliation into procedure. But the thing about disrespect is that it leaves fingerprints you can't sand out, not even with a robe and a seal. And I'll tell you the part that keeps me awake some nights. When Alicia said I came for justice, not your permission, a corner of the judge's mouth twitched. Not in humor, in fear. The kind of flicker you get when you sense a storm you can't forecast. That day he kicked her out of his courtroom, unaware he was throwing away his own dignity. Unaware, too, that the woman he dismissed would soon walk back through a different door, carrying a different kind of authority. And he would be the one asked to answer. People like to say the law is blind. I don't know about that. What I saw that morning was a law that looked away. But stories don't end where a door closes. Sometimes they begin there. And if you'd been sitting where I sat, feeling that heat, hearing that gavel, you would have asked the same question I did as the next witness took the stand. Who is Alicia Monroe, and what will it cost him that he didn't bother to learn? The rain came down the moment Alicia stepped outside the courthouse, heavy, unrelenting, as if the sky itself had taken her side. She didn't open her umbrella, didn't rush to her car. She just kept walking, heels clicking against the wet pavement, her blouse clinging to her shoulders. It wasn't rain, it was every tear she'd held back. She reached her car and sat in silence, listening to the storm drum against the windshield. Through the rear-view mirror, the courthouse blurred into a gray ghost behind her. She watched it fade until it disappeared completely, then whispered to herself, "Guess that's what justice looks like when it rains." Her hands trembled as she opened the glove compartment. Inside lay a brown folder, the edges warped and soft from time. She pulled it out and opened it, her old law license. Alicia Brooks, attorney at law. That name didn't belong to her anymore. She brushed her thumb over the embossed seal, the paper yellowed like something left too long in the sun. She stared at it for a while, then whispered to her reflection in the glass, "You really thought you were done, didn't you?" Her mind drifted back 15 years to a smaller courtroom, a younger version of herself, and the same man behind the bench. Judge Robert Harlan. Back then, she was the youngest civil rights attorney in the state, fierce and idealistic, representing a black schoolteacher falsely accused of theft. She'd built her case, carefully believed the truth would hold. But when she stood to deliver her final argument, Harlan leaned forward and spoke with that quiet cruelty only power can afford. "The law doesn't need sympathy, especially from people like you." The words hit harder than any gavel. The courtroom went still, except for the faint sound of someone stifling a laugh. Alicia froze, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she suddenly knew it wouldn't matter. Not in his courtroom. Not from her lips. Her client was convicted. 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 7 years later, new evidence proved his innocence. But by then it was too late. His body was free, but his life was gone. Alicia's career collapsed with the verdict. Her name became a whisper, then a stain, then nothing. She dropped her maiden name, Brooks, took her mother's Monroe, and vanished. She traded the courtroom for community halls, teaching people how to read their rights, how to face the system that never faced them back. And yet, even in exile, she couldn't escape it. Justice had a way of following her like a shadow, close enough to remind her it still existed, far enough to never touch. Rain hammered harder on the roof. Alicia closed the folder, set it gently on the passenger seat, and rested her head against the steering wheel. Her reflection in the mirror looked older, stronger but sadder too. He erased my name from the law book, she whispered, but not from justice. Lightning flashed across the sky, lighting up the courthouse dome in the distance. For a brief second, it looked like a monument of ghosts. She watched it glow, then fade back into the storm. Some storms wash you away. Others clear the road ahead. And Alicia Monroe's storm, after 15 long years, had just begun. The phone rang just as the storm began to fade. The sound cut through the steady hum of rain on the glass, sharp, deliberate, like it had been waiting for the right silence to arrive. Alicia hesitated before answering. The caller ID flashed a name she hadn't seen in years. Linda Graves, Governor's Office, Atlanta. She picked up. Linda, a warm but cautious voice came through, softened by years of friendship and politics. It's official, Alicia. The board just voted. You're the new State Judicial Oversight Director. For a moment, Alicia didn't speak. The rain kept whispering against the window, the world holding its breath for her reply. So, she finally said the words, barely finding their way past the quiet shock. It's my turn now. Linda exhaled, half relief, half worry. You earned this. Nobody deserves it more. But listen, Atlanta's giving you the freedom to start wherever you want. You don't have to face him first. Alicia closed her eyes. She didn't need to ask who him was. Some ghosts have names you never forget. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides an old scar. If I avoid him, I'll stay his victim forever. There was a long silence on the line. Even Linda, who'd known her since law school, didn't know how to answer that. Finally, she said softly, then promise me one thing, don't let power change you. Alicia leaned against the cool window, watching a thin line of sunlight cut through the clouds. Power doesn't change people, Linda. It just shows who they already were. Her tone wasn't angry. It was steady calm, almost too calm. The kind of calm that makes people listen. Linda sighed. You've always had that tone, you know. The one that scares men who think justice is theirs to give. Alicia laughed softly, a sound more like remembering than joy. Maybe, but justice doesn't need anger. It needs memory. There was something final in that line, like she wasn't just talking to Linda anymore. She was talking to the rain, to the courthouse, still glistening in the distance, to her younger self, who once stood trembling in front of a gavel and learned what silence really costs. Linda's voice came again, gentler now. You sure you're ready to go back? Alicia's hand brushed over her old law license, still sitting on the seat beside her. I don't think anyone's ever ready to go back. But sometimes you go anyway. The sound of papers shuffling came through the receiver. The governor's office will announce it publicly tomorrow. They'll send over your briefing. You'll have access to every judge's record, every disciplinary file in the state. Alicia raised an eyebrow. Every judge, every single one, Linda confirmed. Then after a pause, including Harlan. That name hit the air like thunder. Alicia didn't move. The storm outside had stopped, but inside the car it still lingered, quiet, heavy, familiar. Linda must have sensed her silence. You don't owe that man anything. You could start with someone else. Ease into it. Alicia smiled again, this time colder. I don't owe him, Linda. I owe justice, a clean record. The line went quiet. Then Linda whispered, God, you still talk like you're in a courtroom. Alicia's voice softened. Maybe that's because I never got to finish my closing argument. The two women stayed on the line a moment longer, breathing through the static. When they finally said goodbye, Alicia didn't start the engine right away. She just sat there watching sunlight break through the clouds, turning puddles into small mirrors. In one of them, she saw her own reflection, older now but still standing. The rain had washed her clean but not empty. She reached for the ignition, but before turning the key, she whispered to no one in particular. 15 years after losing my voice, I'm going back to the same room, not to speak. She paused, her gaze hardening toward the horizon, but to be heard. And with that, Alicia Monroe started the car heading toward Atlanta. The road ahead was slick, shining under the fading storm like a mirror, leading her back to the place where it all began. The rumor started like most things do in a courthouse, quietly behind a half-closed door and a cup of lukewarm coffee. By noon, it had made its way through every corridor, whispered over copy machines, passed down marble stairways, stitched with the kind of excitement only fear can bring. "Someone from Atlanta's coming," a clerk murmured. "An oversight director. They say it's official." Another voice added, "She's supposed to audit Judge Harlan's court next week." Nobody said it loudly, but everyone thought the same thing about time. Inside his office, Judge Robert Harlan leaned back in his leather chair, the blinds half drawn so sunlight striped across his desk. The man loved order, especially the kind that reminded everyone else who held it. When his bailiff delivered the news, he didn't even look up from the paperwork. "An oversight director, huh?" His lips curled. "Another paper pusher from Atlanta. They'll last a week." The bailiff pretended to laugh, unsure if it was a joke. Ethan Cole, the young clerk standing by the file cabinet, kept his eyes on the folders, but his ears open. "Do we know who it is, sir?" he asked carefully. Harlan adjusted his tie in the window's reflection, straightening it with the precision of a man who thought appearances could outlast time. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Whoever it is, I'll teach them how a real court works." He turned, signing the last page of a motion with a firm stroke, the kind that didn't invite correction. Then his gaze drifted toward the framed photo on his desk, his sun uniform pressed smile frozen. The judge's eyes softened for a heartbeat before hardening again. "He thought power was permanent," the voice in my memory would say later, "but even marble cracks under truth." Outside that office, the gossip kept running like a current. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed louder than usual. Two secretaries traded theories over sandwiches. "They say the new director's a woman," one said. "A woman," the other replied, eyebrows high. "Good luck. Harlan eats people like that for breakfast." But Ethan, who happened to pass by, slowed his step. "A woman from Atlanta oversight director." He didn't know why, but something about it made him stop and think. He pictured the woman from a few weeks ago, the one who'd stood in court calm under fire and been thrown out for daring to speak. He remembered the look she gave the judge before the officers took her away. Not fear, not defeat, something steadier. He didn't say a word, just nodded politely to the women and walked off, a strange tightness settling in his chest. Back upstairs, Harlan was already planning his next docket, talking to himself as he worked. "These bureaucrats never last," he muttered. "They come with their clipboards and questions, thinking they can tell me how to run my courtroom." He leaned back again, hands clasped behind his head. Outside his door, staff moved carefully, each step measured, afraid to break the fragile calm of his moods. He'd been here so long that the courthouse itself seemed to carry his shadow, the same corridors, the same gavel, the same deference that made him feel untouchable. But the wind outside was changing. Down the hall, Ethan sat at his desk, flipping through an old case file. The rain from earlier had stopped, but through the high windows, the light had turned gray again, the kind of afternoon that feels like it's waiting for something. He thought about asking Harlan who this new director really was, but he didn't. Some questions are safer when left unanswered. He looked out the window toward the parking lot where a new nameplate had just been installed on the reserved space near the front steps, Director State Judicial Oversight Office. No one inside the courthouse noticed it yet. Ethan smiled faintly, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the quiet irony of it all. Maybe it was the feeling that the ground was starting to shift under everyone's feet, and the only man who couldn't feel it was the one standing highest. The courthouse clock struck 5, echoing through the marble halls. Clerks packed up, doors closed, but whispers still floated in the air like dust that refused to settle. Everyone was waiting for the new boss. Everyone except the man who should have been afraid. By the time the black government sedan pulled up in front of the courthouse, the entire building had already stopped pretending to work. Windows filled with faces. Clerks stood half hidden behind blinds. Even the bailiffs leaned on the stair railings, pretending not to stare. The rain had dried, but the air still carried that after-storm hush, the kind that feels like the world holding its breath. When the car door opened, Alicia Monroe stepped out. Dark navy suit, pressed white shirt, a badge glinting against her lapel. Director Alicia Monroe, State Judicial Oversight Office. Heads turned. Conversations cut short. Somewhere a phone stopped ringing mid-tone. Linda Graves followed a step behind her heels, clicking sharp against the concrete. She leaned closer, voice low enough that only Alicia could hear. "You sure you're ready?" Alicia didn't slow her pace. 15 years late, she said quietly, is still on time. The front doors opened before she reached them. A security officer held one side, open eyes wide the other door, swinging with the weight of anticipation. The smell of old paper and polished wood greeted her like a memory she'd rather forget. The same corridors, the same marble echo, the same courtroom where her voice had once been silenced. Only this time she didn't walk in to be judged. She walked in to judge. Inside, Judge Robert Harlan was halfway through sentencing a defendant. His voice filled the room stern and self-satisfied. This court he began, and then he stopped. The doors had opened again. Every head turned as Alicia entered. For a moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hesitate. She walked slowly down the aisle, her steps measured, calm, the quiet kind of confidence that makes others straighten in their seats. Ethan Cole was the first to recognize her. He felt his pulse jump, his hand tightening around the file he was holding. He didn't dare look at Harlan yet. Alicia reached the front row and paused. The plaque on the bench read, "Judge Robert Harlan." She looked at it for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, long enough for him to feel it. Harlan's brow furrowed. He leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "What is she doing here?" Ethan swallowed hard, his voice even but his throat dry. "Sir, that's the new State Judicial Oversight Director." The words hit harder than any gavel. The entire courtroom went still. Someone in the back dropped a pen. A reporter's hand froze mid-note. Harlan straightened as if posture could still protect him. His face, usually carved in certainty, began to pale. Alicia met his gaze and smiled faintly, polite, professional, merciless. "Good morning, Judge," she said evenly. "I'll be observing your proceedings today." Her voice was calm, but every syllable landed with precision, the kind of voice that didn't ask for permission anymore. Harlan blinked, trying to process. Observing, he repeated like he'd misheard English for the first time. Alicia tilted her head just slightly. "Yes, Judge. From today forward, your courtroom will be under state review." He tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "Under review by you?" Her smile didn't change. Her eyes didn't blink. "And Judge," she said, her tone dropping to something colder, quieter, "I'm not from the board. I run it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. No one dared to move. The prosecutor stood frozen mid-note. The stenographer's fingers hovered above her keys. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow. Ethan finally exhaled. The faintest sound escaped him, something between disbelief and awe. Harlan's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in years, he was speechless. He looked at Alicia as if seeing her for the first time, not as the woman he'd dismissed, but as a force that now held his future between two steady hands. Alicia turned slightly, facing the gallery. "Please continue," she said to the attorneys. "I'm just here to observe." Then she sat down front row center, the same spot where she'd been escorted out all those years ago. Except now no one was escorting her anywhere. Linda stood in the back, watching the judge struggle to regain his composure. Ethan caught her eye. She gave a barely perceptible nod. The twist had landed. The scales had shifted. Harlan cleared his throat, flipping through papers he no longer saw. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. The sentencing will proceed as scheduled." But everyone knew it wouldn't. Not really, not anymore. Because when Alicia Monroe entered that courtroom, she didn't just return to the scene of an old humiliation, she rewrote it. The same woman he'd thrown out now sat in the front row with the authority to throw him away. And though no one said a word, everyone in that room felt the same thing: justice had just walked back in. When the session ended, the sound of shuffling papers and closing briefcases filled the courtroom. But Judge Harlan stayed seated longer than usual. His jaw worked tight and controlled. The smile he gave the gallery was polite, almost gracious, but his knuckles gripping the armrest had gone white. He waited until the last attorney left before calling out Cole. "My office." Ethan Cole hesitated at the door. The judge's tone was calm, too calm. That was always the warning sign. Inside, Harlan shut the blinds and loosened his tie. The moment the latch clicked, the mask dropped. His face hardened, eyes sharp as cut glass. "Find me everything about her," he snapped. "Old cases, old names, anything." Ethan froze. Sir Harlan's voice rose. "Don't sir me. You think she just appeared here? No, someone like her doesn't climb this high without stepping on something or someone. Find it." Ethan swallowed, then nodded carefully. "Yes, Judge." When he stepped out, he could still feel the heat of that office at his back. He knew what it meant when powerful men said, "Find me something." It never ended cleanly. By afternoon, the courthouse buzzed again, but this time not with admiration. Screens lit up across offices. Inboxes chimed. A headline spread through the state's internal legal network like oil on water. Director Alicia Monroe, under internal review for misconduct. The words were clean, official, and completely false. In Atlanta, Linda burst into Alicia's office waving her tablet. "He's trying to ruin your name before your first report." Alicia looked up from her files, calm as a still pond. "Who sent it?" "They don't know yet," Linda said. "But it's spreading. Judges are forwarding it. Staff are whispering. It's everywhere." Alicia rose from her chair and walked to the mirror on the far wall. Her reflection met her like an old rival, composed unreadable. "They want chaos," she said quietly. "I'll give them calm." Linda stared at her, confused and frustrated. You can't just stay quiet, but Alicia already knew what to do. Fighting noise with noise was how people like Harlan won. Instead, she'd bury him with what he feared most: truth. That night, her desk glowed under the low lamplight. Case files, transcripts, appeal letters, years of forgotten paperwork piled around her like ghosts waiting to testify. She combed through each one line by line, marking patterns only someone who'd lived in justice could see. 22 cases. 22 times Judge Robert Harlan had ruled against evidence, ignored witnesses, or silenced defense attorneys. Each file was a story of someone who'd walked into his courtroom believing justice still had a pulse, and walked out learning it didn't. Alicia organized the records, scanning pages, cross-referencing verdicts. Her fingers moved fast, steady, purposeful. Meanwhile, miles away, Ethan sat at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. He stared at the judge's office door, dark, silent, and then at his own computer screen. His cursor blinked over a folder labeled "Closed Cases, Harlan R." He hesitated, then clicked. He didn't know exactly why he was doing it, maybe guilt, maybe faith, but he knew right from wrong, and this felt like a chance to tip the scales. A few keystrokes later, a batch of encrypted files uploaded to a secure state database. The progress bar crept forward slowly, each percent like a confession. When it hit 100%, Ethan sat back, exhaled, and whispered to the empty room, "Let justice read what we couldn't say." Back in Atlanta, Alicia's screen pinged. A new message appeared. "Evidence received, state database verified." She leaned back in her chair, eyes on the glowing monitor. Her reflection shimmered faintly against it, a woman carved from resolve and restraint. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a quiet breath of relief. Linda peeked in, still anxious. "Well," Alicia smiled faintly. "The noise will fade. The truth won't." Outside, thunder rolled far away, a reminder that some storms don't announce themselves until they're already overhead. Alicia turned off her lamp, leaving the city lights to do the rest. That night, while rumors kept running wild through the courthouse halls, the real story began to move quietly through the state's servers, steady, invisible, unstoppable. And somewhere in the darkness, the balance of power shifted again. The woman they'd tried to silence hadn't fought back with rage. She'd answered with proof. And proof, unlike rumor, doesn't disappear when the lights come on. The courthouse was quieter than usual that morning, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels planned, the kind that holds its breath before a verdict. Judge Robert Harlan had cleared his calendar, sent his clerk on an errand, and locked his door. He sat at his desk, hands clasped, pretending to read a report he hadn't really looked at for the past 20 minutes. He'd been waiting. The knock came at precisely 9, firm, controlled. "Come in," he said. The door opened and Alicia Monroe stepped inside. She closed it behind her, slow and deliberate. No entourage, no aide, no audience, just her and the man who'd once thrown her out of his courtroom like she didn't belong in it. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The air between them felt thick, charged like static before lightning. Harlan finally broke the silence with a forced chuckle. Director Monroe, he said, standing halfway. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Alicia didn't smile. She crossed the room and stopped in front of his desk. No judge, she said quietly. We've been on that foot for 15 years. She set a heavy file on the desk. It landed with a soft thud that somehow filled the whole room. Harlan's eyes dropped to the stack pages bound neatly labeled in sharp black print, 22 verified cases. She opened it slowly, turning it toward him. Case numbers, names, rulings, each one stamped with his signature. He frowned. What is this supposed to be history? She replied. Yours. His jaw tightened. He pushed the file back. You came here because you hate me. Alicia's voice stayed calm, almost gentle. I don't hate you, Judge. Hate builds nothing. Justice rebuilds. Harlan stood pacing behind his desk. You think you can destroy me? You think you can walk in here and erase 30 years on this bench? Alicia folded her arms. I'm not here to erase you. I'm here to remind you what that bench was built for. He stopped, turning sharply toward her. You don't know what I've lost. He shouted, the words breaking through the practiced composure he wore like armor. Alicia didn't flinch. She looked at him not with triumph, but with something quieter, heavier. Then tell me, Judge, she said softly. Maybe it's time someone finally listened. That line hung in the air like a verdict. Harlan blinked, thrown off balance by her tone. He sank slowly back into his chair, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the edge of the desk. He looked down at the photo beside his gavel, his son in uniform, smile, bright eyes, young. For a moment, Harlan's anger cracked. You could almost hear it. Alicia noticed. Her gaze flicked to the picture. She didn't speak, but the silence between them shifted less like a battle, more like an opening. Harlan swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was rougher. He died in a protest. Wrong place, wrong time. They said it was an accident, but I knew better. Alicia waited. She didn't interrupt. I blame them, he said, gesturing vaguely as if the word them covered half the world. Every time I looked into a face like yours, I saw the ones who took him. Alicia nodded once, slow, steady. And so you punished the world for it. He didn't answer. His shoulders sagged. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by something worse, recognition. Alicia stepped forward, her tone still even. I'm not here to undo your grief, Judge, but grief isn't an excuse for injustice. It never was. He stared at her eyes, tired now. You have no idea what it's like to lose everything. She leaned in slightly. You're wrong. I lost my name in this room, my career, my voice. But I found something else, perspective. Harlan's hand went back to the photo. His thumb brushed over his son's face like he could feel life in the paper. Maybe, he whispered, maybe I lost myself with him. Alicia nodded. Then find yourself again, but not through cruelty. She closed the file gently, her fingertips pressing the folder shut like sealing a chapter. The board will review these cases. What happens next is in their hands. As she turned to leave, Harlan's voice stopped her, not angry, not commanding, but almost pleading. Director? Is this mercy or punishment? She paused at the door. Neither, she said quietly. It's accountability. And then she was gone. For a long time, Harlan sat in silence. The room felt heavier now. He stared at the photograph again, the weight of years collapsing around him. He reached out, gripping the frame until his knuckles went pale. His reflection in the glass met his son's frozen smile, and for the first time in a long time, the judge looked small. His anger melted into something raw and unfamiliar. Not fear, not pride, just regret. And in that quiet office behind closed doors, Robert Harlan's eyes glistened, not with fury, but with the thing he'd forgotten how to feel. Remorse. Silence settled between them, like dust after a collapse. Harlan's shoulders sagged, the fight gone from his voice before the words even formed. He died in a protest gone wrong, he said, each syllable pulled from someplace he'd kept locked. I blamed all of you for it. The sentence hung there, blunt, unadorned, impossible to argue with, and yet impossible to accept. Alicia didn't move. She let the truth take its full shape before she answered. Pain doesn't excuse injustice, she said softly. It just passes it on. Harlan's eyes flicked to the photograph again, as if the frame might answer for him. He rubbed the glass with his thumb, polishing a spot that wasn't dirty. You don't understand, he tried. but the insistence in his tone had thinned to thread. A knock, gentle, hesitant, broke the stillness. The door opened a crack. Ethan Cole stepped in, a folder tucked to his chest like something fragile. "Director," he said, voice careful, the board verified all findings. He's facing review." Alicia accepted the folder without looking away from Harlan. She opened to the top page, scanned it once, then turned it so the judge could see. The seal of the state shone up at him like a mirror he hadn't asked to face. Harlan's hand trembled when he reached for the pen. He stared at the line where his name was supposed to go, and for a second it seemed like he might put the pen down, might choose another way to live with himself. But the second passed. He signed, a small scratchy signature from a man who used to carve his name into rooms. The pen clinked against the desk. Ethan exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "This isn't punishment," Judge Alicia said, her voice even almost kind. "It's truth catching up." Harlan's jaw tensed. He swallowed, and when the words came, they were raw. "You've won." Alicia shook her head. "No," she said. "I've only reminded the law who it serves." The line didn't land like victory. It landed like relief, heavy, necessary, overdue. Harlan leaned back, deflated. The office, with its polished wood and careful order, suddenly felt too small for what was happening inside it. He looked older in the light, as if regret had a way of aging a man in minutes. His gaze traveled past Alicia to Ethan, lingered there, and something almost like apology flickered across his face. "I kept believing that certainty was the same as righteousness," he murmured. "I let grief make that mistake for me." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't the one being asked to. But he took one step closer, as if standing within the truth made it easier to hold. Alicia closed the folder and set it gently on the desk. "The board will proceed from here," she said. "There will be a formal notice, a hearing, a path you'll have to walk. But it's a path. Well, that matters." Harlan nodded without lifting his head. "And after Alicia said you'll still be a father. You can decide what kind of man stands next to that." He flinched at the word father, not in anger, but in recognition. The fight that had once defined him was gone, replaced by the kind of quiet that doesn't pretend to be anything else. Ethan glanced toward the door. "Do you want me to?" No, Harlan said, and his voice surprised both of them with its steadiness. "Stay." The judge reached for the photograph. He hesitated, then lifted it from the desk with both hands. The glass caught the room's light, and for a brief moment father and son were layered over his reflection, who he was, who he had been, who he might have been if grief hadn't done his thinking. He set the frame in his lap and traced the edge with a fingertip. His eyes brimmed. When the first tear slipped free, he didn't wipe it away. Alicia turned toward the door, giving him privacy without leaving him alone. Ethan remained where he was, a quiet witness, shoulders squared, not in judgment, but in presence. Behind them, Harlan spoke to the photo the way a man speaks to a grave when no one's around to hear. "I thought if I kept the world small, I could keep you safe in it." No one answered him. That was the point. Alicia rested her hand on the doorknob and looked back one last time. "Accountability isn't the end," she said. "It's the beginning of better." Harlan closed his eyes. A shallow nod. He lifted the framed thumb, pressing the brass latch, and slid the photo free from its stand. He held it close, too close to see, and then with a shaky breath, he lowered it into the desk drawer. When the drawer shut, the sound was soft, almost ceremonial. Alicia stepped into the hallway. Ethan followed, pulling the door to just short of closed. Through the narrow gap, they saw the judge fold forward, elbows on his knees, a man finally alone with the truth. Inside that room, the most powerful thing happened, the one thing no gavel can order and no appeal can undo. Robert Harlan wept. 1 week later, the morning news carried the headline that rippled quietly through Georgia's legal world. Judge Robert Harlan suspended pending ethics review. The anchors read it like any other story, but to those who had watched it unfold, it sounded different, like the system finally taking a breath after years of holding it in. In a small apartment on the city's edge, Ethan Cole watched the report play out on TV. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten beside him. When Harlan's face appeared on the screen, once proud now, humbled, Ethan exhaled slowly. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Justice had moved. Not loudly, not cruelly, but surely. Miles away, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the State Judicial Oversight Office. Alicia Monroe sat at her desk, papers neatly arranged the morning calm, wrapping around her like peace earned not given. Linda Graves pushed open the door, a folder in hand and relief written across her face. "It's over," she said gently. "You did it." Alicia looked up, a quiet strength in her eyes. "Justice isn't about ending people," she replied. "It's about ending patterns." Linda smiled, a mix of pride and awe. "Still, Alicia, you changed the system." Alicia shook her head with a soft exhale. "No, I reminded it how to change itself." Before Linda could answer, a knock came at the door. Ethan stepped in, holding a small envelope. His tone was careful, respectful. "This just arrived for you. No return address, but I think you'll want to see it." Alicia accepted it, unfolded the letter, and read in silence. The handwriting was neat but shaky, the kind of script that comes from an unsteady hand, learning to be honest again. "Director Monroe, thank you for not humiliating me publicly. You had every right to, and you didn't. I will face the review. Whatever happens next, I'll accept it. Maybe the law still has room for men like me to learn from the damage we caused. Robert Harlan." She folded the paper carefully, as if sealing an old wound. Then with a quiet steadiness she said, "Humiliation changes nothing. Accountability does." Ethan hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you really think people like him can change?" Alicia met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "I think pain changes us. But what we do after, that's what defines who we are." For a long moment, no one spoke. The city hummed faintly outside, distant traffic, a siren, the heartbeat of life continuing on. Linda leaned against the doorframe. "So what now?" Alicia turned toward the window, watching the light climb across the skyline. "Now," she said, "we keep doing the quiet work, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but keeps the balance." The narrator's voice entered softly, wrapping around the moment like a reflection. For the first time in years, justice breathed again. Not as vengeance, not as victory, but as balance restored. Ethan glanced once more at Alicia, at the calm in her presence, the quiet authority in her stillness, and realized something simple yet profound: the strongest people don't shout when they win. They rebuild in silence. As the morning sun warmed the office walls, Alicia placed Harlan's letter in a drawer, closed it gently, and whispered, "Justice doesn't erase pain. It teaches us how to live with it honestly." Outside, the city stirred awake. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Alicia Monroe allowed herself to smile, not for triumph, but for peace. Late afternoon draped the courthouse in gold. The same marble halls that once echoed with authority now stood quiet, carrying only the faint hum of distant footsteps. Alicia Monroe walked slowly through them, her heels tapping softly against the floor. She wasn't there for duty this time, only closure. When she reached courtroom 3B, she paused at the door. It creaked open the way old doors do, as if remembering everything that had ever passed through them. Inside, the room was empty. Dust floated through slanted beams of light, and the air smelled faintly of polish and history. She walked toward the judge's bench, the same one she had once been ordered to leave. Her fingertips brushed across the smooth wood, tracing the edge where her voice had been silenced years ago. "Funny," she murmured. "It feels smaller now." The words weren't bitter. They were soft, almost amused, like a woman who had finally outgrown the shadow that once loomed over her. Behind her, the door opened quietly. Linda Graves stepped in, a warm smile cutting through the solemn air. "I figured I'd find you here," Linda said. Then after a pause, "Do you regret forgiving him?" Alicia turned, the light catching her face just right, strong, calm, at peace. "No," she said. "Some people need to see what grace looks like before they change." Linda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Grace is harder than punishment." "That's why it works," Alicia said simply. The door opened again, and Ethan Cole entered, holding a single document in his hand. His tie was loosened, his eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. "Director," he said, handing it to her. "It's official. Judge Harlan has resigned voluntarily." Alicia unfolded the paper, scanning it quickly. The signature at the bottom was steady, no anger, no denial, just acceptance. She smiled faintly. "Then the system still works. When it chooses to." Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "You know," he said, "I used to think justice meant punishment, but you taught me it's something else entirely." Alicia tilted her head. And what's that making things right without making people small? Ethan said quietly. You taught me what justice really means. For a moment she studied him, the idealism in his voice, the sincerity that reminded her of the lawyer she'd once been. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Then go teach it again, she said, quietly. He nodded, eyes bright. As Alicia turned back toward the empty bench, the sunlight had shifted, spilling through the tall windows in long golden stripes. It painted everything in warmth, the chairs, the walls, even the gavel that sat abandoned on the desk. She walked toward the exit, each step slow but sure, her reflection gliding along the polished floor beside her. At the doorway, she stopped for one last look at the room that had once defined her pain and now her redemption. Outside, the courtyard glowed. The white columns rose tall against the fading sky, and as she descended the steps, the light wrapped around her shoulders like forgiveness itself. The voice of the narrator came soft, deliberate, carrying the kind of truth that lingers after the story fades. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It whispers and still changes everything. Alicia kept walking until the courthouse disappeared behind her. The city stretched out ahead, alive, imperfect, but somehow lighter. And as she stepped into the sun, she wasn't just a woman who'd faced injustice. She was the proof that grace in the right hands could be stronger than revenge. And that day, for the first time in a long time, justice didn't need to be seen to be felt. It was enough to be heard quietly.